Hi, everybody, and welcome to Heel Heat. My name is George Coles, and on this episode, we're doing It Came from the Network. The topic of this It Came from the Network: World Class Championship Wrestling from April 11th, 1987. Now, on my last It Came from the Network, I mentioned that I was going to find Lance Von Erich's first television match and review that. I couldn't nail it down exactly, so I kind of went the opposite direction. And I might be wrong. I looked through all of the episodes on Peacock of World Class Championship Wrestling, and I looked at the descriptions, and because Peacock doesn't list matches like the WWE Network used to list, the best I could figure, the last time that they showed in the description Lance Von Erich Wrestling was the show we're about to watch, or about to review. I've already watched it. World Class Championship Wrestling from April 11th, 1987. Marked as Season 6, Episode 15. This is a very interesting show. We're going to talk about something here in a little bit that's ties into the Von Erich curse. So, yeah, there's going to be some sensitive topics being touched here. If you've not seen one of my shows before, we rate everything on a 1 to 5 scale, 1 being the worst, 5 being the best. First match of the show, we get the Rock and Roll RPMs, which is Tommy Lane and Mike Davis. Yes, everything in the 80s, they tried to emulate the Rock and Roll Express's success. We had the Rock and Roll RPMs, the Midnight Rockers that later became the Rockers, and several other iterations that had some kind of rock and roll, similar gimmick to the Rock and Roll Express. Rock and Roll RPMs, no exception in that. They're going up against Steve Simpson and Skip Young, somewhat of a, I guess you could kind of say a super team for mid-carders. I never knew that these two tagged together. I know both of them very well. Steve Simpson kind of, in times, reminds me a little bit of a Jungle Boy type. He's very lean, has a very puffy, curly hair. The Rock and Roll RPMs, being a Rock and Roll Express copy, they played more often as heels, so they were more like a mashup of the Rock and Roll Express and the Midnight Express. They took a lot of their in-ring style from the Midnight Express, and they took a lot of their gear styling from the Rock and Roll Express, if that makes sense. They were actually a pretty good group, and they were probably of the carbon copy tag teams, they were one of the better ones. The Rockers obviously are the best. Marty Jannetty and Shawn Michaels. I mean, you got one of the great workers of all time, and you also got Shawn Michaels. No, I'm just kidding. Shawn is one of the great workers of all time. Marty is very, very good and gets a little bit underrated. This was not really that good of a match, and the finish really took it down a peg for me. Skip Young was going for a head scissors. He gets hit by one of the RPMs. Looks like he still does the head scissors, but it ends up he gets pinned off of it. It was a terrible finish, which the match wasn't great going into that, but I probably would have scored better if the finish was better than it was. The Rock and Roll RPMs pick up the win on this. I'm giving this a 2. Again, because of the finish and how poor it was executed, I can't really grade this much better than that. Next up, we have a battle of the Mikes. Mike Williams versus Mike Von Erich. And funny, because I grew up with a kid named Mike Williams, where, well, probably a lot of people did. Both Mike and Williams are common names. After this, and after what comes next, I'm going to mention a few things about this. This was not a good match at all. Mike Von Erich, for as much as he tried, and this was after he had toxic shock syndrome and already had brain damage. as much as he tried, he just wasn't as good as Kerry, Kevin, or David. And it's a real shame because it seems to have played on him. And again, in a minute, I'm going to touch more on that. Strictly talking about the match wasn't good at all. Mike Von Erich picks up the win. Afterwards, Brian Diaz comes out, who he was in a feud with at the time, and they kind of battle a little bit. I'm giving this a 2. Afterwards, we get an interview with both Spike Huber, who did pretty decent, and Mike Von Erich, who... What I'm going to say after this is going to make this feel really shitty, but I have to separate what I see on the television and what I know happened in real life. This was not a good interview by Mike Von Erich. He stumbles over everything. I know he has brain damage. They should not have put him on TV. They really should. What I'm going to mention now, the date of this, if you're a world-class fan, you will notice the significance. And I did not realize this going into it because I don't remember dates like this. I couldn't even tell you the date of any of the WrestleManias I went to, or the date of the first Double or Nothing that I went to that I flew halfway across the country for. I couldn't tell you, other than one ECW arena show because it was on my 21st birthday, I couldn't tell you the dates of any ECW pay-per-views or shows I went to. That being said, when watching this, I did not know the date, and I went back after to review I didn't know the significance of the date. I went back to see if this was post the brain injury for Mike Von Erich, which would explain the terrible promo. Not only is it post his toxic shock syndrome and brain damage, it is one day, if the date is right that they put on the network, one day before he commits suicide. And I know everything I just said about him having a bad match and a bad promo really feels crappy right now, because it feels crappy to me. It really does. This was one of the things, and I mentioned this, I just did a video about things that drove wrestling fans away. One of the things that drove wrestling fans from World Class was the amount of death and the amount of suicides, specifically within the Von Erich family. And it just doesn't feel good watching this. It doesn't feel good knowing that that person struggling through the match and struggling through the promo was probably being pressured to being out there, was probably being pressured to be a replacement for I believe it was David who committed suicide first or died first. I don't remember which ones committed suicide or which ones just died of natural causes, but I do believe this was definitely after, so I'm pretty sure Mike was pressured into being the third Von Erich, especially since they did a lot of six-man tag matches, which is why another thing that we're going to get into later became a thing. I really hate that I had to give poor reviews to it, but I gotta call it objectively. So that's my explanation for that. If you look this up, it makes it a little bit more understandable, but it also puts a big downpour on everything that's on the show. Moving on from that, clearing our palate, we get Spike Huber versus Ken Fletcher. The thing that stuck out to me on this match was Spike Huber came into the match with a jacket that said Union Made on the back. He was very much playing a union worker, which is hysterical when you know in the history of wrestling, unions have been shot down time and time and time again and vehemently fought against by the promotions. So it was interesting that they would even let him do that kind of a gimmick. Spike Huber picks up the win here in what I would say is another underwhelming match at the very best. I'm giving this one a 2. Again, like I said, just an underwhelming match. So far, the first 3 matches of the nights, I couldn't say anything positive about them. Last but not least, we get the main event of the evening. Nord the Barbarian and Eli the Eliminator, which are 2 great names, by the way. Nord later goes on to be the Berserker, or Yukon John Nord in AWA, going up against the reason for the video, Lance Von Erich, in his last match that I could see advertised on the network, and Red River Jack, which, if you don't know who Red River Jack is Bruiser Brody with a mask on. And this was great. Gary Hart, the manager, I believe he's Nord's manager at the time, is saying Brody through the whole match. So I know it's one of those things like the Midnight Rider, or when other wrestlers would put on a mask to hide their identity, but still make it obvious who they were, like the Bullet is Bob Armstrong. It's kind of funny seeing these, is what I'm trying to get out. It's not really done that much anymore. I want to say the last time this was done was the Mr. America character. I know we had a Juan Cena, but that was only done at a house show. It's a good trope. This by far was the best match of the night, and by that, it wasn't even a great match. It ends up with a double disqualification where both the Eliminator and Nord, their managers, get involved, which should have cost them a disqualification, but everybody's fighting. They throw it out because the match is out of control. Afterwards, we see Kevin Von Erich come down to make the save, run off the heels. I'm giving this match a 3. I hated the ending again. It was very wonky. The match was better, but the ending was terrible still. And I know I've seen one of the people I've heard say it the most is Jim Cornette, that the booking style in World Class was behind the times even in this time, and it was very simplistic. I understand that, and I understand for the time. I try to adjust to the time period, but even for the time period, this was a bad show. Like I said, I give this match a 3. Overall, I give the show a 2. Probably less if I think of how much of a downer the show really is, because of what I found out about Mike afterwards. Things I did love. I love any time I can see Bruiser Brody, whether it's Brody or Red River Jack. Brody is one of my absolute favorites of all time. I love seeing him in here. Spike Huber is someone I like a lot. Steve Simpson, the Rock and Roll RPMs. I like the Rock and Roll RPMs. A lot of the wrestlers on this show I liked. However, the matches I didn't. But that's my opinion on this one. Please like this, share, subscribe if you haven't. And if you made it all the way to the end, let's leave this one on a positive note. Let's send out some good karma into the world. Rest in peace. Let's put rest in peace Mike in the comments for Mike Von Erich. Hopefully he is resting in peace. This is 30 years ago now, so hopefully he has been resting in peace. With all that being said, my name is George Coles, and this has been another It Came From the Network.